Hello, Furidashi listeners. In this episode, Lauren and I discuss the popular browser game Wordle, which was a worldwide phenomenon and yet somehow escaped notice when it came time to list the best games of 2022. We also discuss the way some video games work their way into the daily and weekly rhythms of our lives, and why those games often find themselves on the outside or on the fringes of what gets to properly be called a video game. Whether you're a Wordle master or merely a dabbler, we think this fun little game has a lot to say about how we integrate games into our social lives. Stay tuned. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Furidashi podcast. I am Nicholas, and I am here with Lauren. Lauren, say hello to the lovely people.
Hello to the lovely people. I am Lauren, and I am here with Nicholas.
Wow, okay. It's like the mirror universe of the podcast.
It is the mirror universe. Sorry, I always do this.
We wanted to thank you all for joining us. We also wanted to remind you that we have a Patreon where you can sign up at the $5 tier for bonus episodes, and you can also sign up at advanced levels for even more wonderful content like transcripts, advanced proofs of our book chapters, all sorts of really cool stuff. So if that's the sort of thing that you're interested in, or if you just want to continue with today's conversation, go on over to patreon.com/Furidashi. So today, Lauren, we're going to be talking about words.
Words, specifically wordly words.
Wordle. Yeah, Wordle. Wordle. Which is like Squirtle, but with words. No,
yeah,
it's actually
but it's
nothing
not
like
Wordle Squad. Yeah.
So I guess just before we get into it, I wanted to ask you, like, how much have you played just like regular like word games, like word finds, like crosswords, like just crap like that?
Yeah, for me, so when I was a kid, I played a lot of these because my mom really likes crossword puzzles.
Yeah.
I had either a high vocabulary or my mother indoctrinated me, and we waited in doctor's offices just forever, that I loved guessing the words. I liked being able to know how the word was spelled but have no idea what it means.
Yeah.
And especially when you're a kid, I think that's what was exciting. I also played a lot of Scrabble, at the my dad's friends parties where we'd go and visit, and then that's always the game of choice was Scrabble, because I think it was a game of how to test your intelligence without being charades or it's a very introvert game, right? You're not going crazy.
Yeah.
Pictionary is also almost too much because now you can make fun of people. So Scrabble is the get to know you game.
Well, yeah, because with Scrabble, you're almost kind of playing your own game alongside other people. It's not so much that you're playing against. I mean, you can
you're not
strategically play against them, but not really.
Yeah, and those once you finally can start to strategically play against them, I think that's when people start to be okay, we shouldn't be playing this with you.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the culture of these word games. Yeah. I would say for me as an individual, I actually played I think 3 or 4 Wordles. I think I have only played 4.
I'm a regular Wordle player. I'm a Wordle grandmaster. If there are grandmasters, my elo.
Oh my god,
my Wordle elo is very high. Mostly because and this is something that we'll get into because we're going to talk about sort of the way things figure into daily rhythms. But when I was a kid, my primary experience with various word games was my mom would buy those really cheap, crappy newsprint collections of word finds that they sell at the grocery store, and she would do those constantly. But for me personally, I would always play. So at the dentist office where I went as a kid, like they would always have Highlights magazine like in the waiting
Yes.
room.
That's what I
And
was thinking of. I just couldn't remember the name of it.
I hate going to the dentist. So when I was at the dentist, like to distract me, I would always like do two things in the Highlights magazines. I would do the pictures where you're supposed to like find things in the
Yes.
pictures, and I would do the cheap, crappy crossword puzzle
Yes.
that was always
Okay.
in Highlights.
We were secretly the same kid growing up, which I think
Yeah.
is really, at least in the dentist or doctor's offices. And then
Yeah.
I had a younger sibling. And so I had to go for myself, but then it's like they never were able to schedule our appointments. So then I
Yeah.
had to do it like again. And I remember going to these and having the Highlights magazine and then realizing it was the same one. And then like that's my writing in that magazine. Like I
Yeah.
was like, dang it. So that's
Yeah,
pretty
so
funny.
so for me, like I play a lot of Wordle because I get up really early in the morning. I usually get up around 6. And the reason for that is because I try to do any of the work that I have to do for like myself. I also edit the podcast in the morning on usually on Mondays. Sometimes on Tuesdays if I'm not feeling it on on that week's Monday. But like initially I'm generally kind of groggy and not really all there, so I'll like make my tea in the morning, and then when I first sit down on my computer, I'll do the Wordle as a kind of way to kind of like wake up my brain, so that way I'm not just completely, zoned out of everything that I'm doing. And so that's why the reason why I bring that up is because like for me, the game really sort of fits into sort of like these daily patterns that I have. And also, you can see that with, the way that, you and I are talking about sort of our experience of word games in the past. Like, your mom is really into crossword puzzles. So it's like integrated into your relationship with her. Or like, when I do the crossword puzzle at the dentist's office because I'm terrified, that's a thing that I would always do that is a habit, even though it's not quite as regular as like being daily or weekly, it still was this consistent thing. And
Yeah, it's your like every 6 month habit or for like every 3 months, right? With a sibling,
yeah,
right? It's
yeah,
something that's very consistent. And I think what's interesting is that unlike these games that I played when I was a kid that were like consistency games, right? Or games that I've shared, it's
yeah,
like I have actually like as a player, I have started to play games that like I don't want to be like I don't share with others because that's not true, but I
yeah,
share them in a different way, right? Like
exactly. Yeah.
I'm not playing Dragon Age side by side with someone anymore. Well, because I would play that with my sister and she would be like my social companion. Like
Yeah.
I'm playing it differently. So like there's this really interesting, I think, comparison you're drawing with like word games are this consistent routine. It's like a routine
Yeah.
type of, I don't know, advantage that like I don't just well, I guess I was about to go into MMO kind of like things, but we don't have to
No,
talk
I
about
think I
that.
think that's an apt comparison. Go there.
No, because for me, I was like trying to say that like I now once again, so I've spoken about this in the past, but like I am neurodivergent, so like the issue of having a routine, right, is
Yeah.
something that is very hard for me, and the fact that I do have a routine is indicated by this calendar that I buy myself every year, as cheap but as pretty as possible, which usually means it comes from Daiso or Target.
Yeah.
And Daiso is cheaper than Target, so if it comes from Target, I've had a very busy like time. And
Splurging on the calendar.
splurging on my calendar, this like $4 paper calendar hung on my wall or on the fridge or whatever, and I have stickers. And every day I do the thing, like the one thing that I'm like, you are gonna freaking routine this,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You're gonna do this, Lauren. I put a sticker, and it's like a happy Daiso sticker. I've got tacos, I've got cotton candy, I've got bear heads, like little bears, like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
stickers, mushrooms.
It's
Like
funny because when we did an episode on gamification, you were very critical of
I
gamification,
am super critical of
and yet you
gamification.
literally gamified your
I do
schedule.
literally gamify everything because it's not actually gamification; it's systemification.
Okay.
It's systemizing. So like I have created a system in whereby I which like I need that reward mentality. But the
Yeah.
more this is not an episode on neurodivergence and how I believe that people who are neurodivergent can make better game experiences because we have to experience our own lives as a game. This is actually talking about the routine
Yeah.
of Wordle, right?
Yeah.
Having to do a Wordle every day. Well, there, I just said it. Having to do the Wordle, it becomes like this task that my brain is like, ooh, now that I have to do it, it's like rushing, like, I don't want to do it.
Yeah.
But so for me, what's interesting is like Final Fantasy 14, right? When I was going to say is playing an MMO is like the same routine. You go on, you play your daily roulettes, right? Every single day, you do your dailies. And for me, like, I think that for the same reason in MMO, I cannot log in every day. It's not that I don't want to log in. Is that
Yeah.
for some reason it's like I just don't log in, I forget about it. I'm like, man, I need to do my dailies. But even when I started in 14 and I wanted to do my dailies, like it was a trudge. And it's the
Yeah.
same way with Wordle, is that I think I can't say my friends didn't play Wordle. That's totally inaccurate. Everyone's playing Wordle. They just
Yeah.
didn't include me because they knew that like it would stress me the fuck out if I
Yeah. Yeah.
was having to be included in like, hey, did you do this? Did you do this? And I'm like, no, I have done nothing. I have one sticker because I did this one thing. Don't make me put a second sticker. That's too many stickers.
Well, it's weird because one of the things that we're going to talk about today is the way in which they're like, this is a relatively recent phenomenon where you have games that are sort of like embedded within or sort of like closely linked to social media and the way social media structure interactions with other people. And Wordle is a really good example of this because Wordle is even designed in such a way that it can have this very like iconic thing that you can share. Like, you finish doing it and you have this like iconic like set of colored squares that you then just like paste into whatever social media platform you want, be it Twitter, be it, I guess people don't do this on Tumblr, but it's very common on Facebook as well. And someone else who plays Wordle can look at that and recognize it immediately what it's saying.
I remember that, seeing that, and I literally was like, what has happened on my Twitter feed? Like, what the hell is happening? Who took over Twitter? It literally my whole feed for a while because I'm in games, and so obviously everyone plays like the latest game. So I tend to see like everyone was playing Endwalker. There were a bunch of just spoiler content. Like literally, it was just like the images that are like click to see spoiler, and I was like, wow, there's like 15 of these in a row. Like I should probably stop being on Twitter. I literally can't engage. And with Wordle, it was like everybody, especially being a narrative too, right? So everyone's like playing Wordle. I was like, I think Twitter is broken. Like, you know what? Like
people have joined a cult. They're
joined a cult. The GOP was right. We're getting hacked. I was like, okay, well, it can't be that one. Like, I was like, what is happening? And I think you're right. Like, it was such a social, I don't know.
Well, it was a social phenomenon. And
a social takeover. That's what it felt like to me as a non-Wordle initiate, a non-Wordleite, if you will.
Well, and it's also very different from like the experience of doing a daily crossword because generally speaking, like those are pretty solitary activities. You're doing it for yourself, you're self-motivated, whereas Wordle has this weird like social motivation as well and like semi-competitive because you can do it in fewer or more guesses. Also like people get can but not necessarily like in an antagonistic way, but more sort of in like, you see your friend, post their Wordle for the day and you're like, oh crap. And it reminds you that maybe you didn't do it that day or like, I could do better.
Yeah, actually, and I wanted to ask you about that because like, okay, so for me, Wordle was incredibly competitive because a lot of like my friends and in game dev like are very into PvP sort of like just shooters in general. So Wordle became this like PvP social like word game. How many like counts could you get in? Like, oh, I got it on first try or I got it on second, right? So it was very competitive. But I wanted to ask you, as someone for myself who's never played Words with Friends.
Yeah.
I've never really been in. I never did Facebook gaming. Like even so, like how does it compare? Or what was the difference between them?
So like okay, so for those of you who aren't familiar, like this is not a new phenomenon. So like Zynga in particular is really well known for making these kinds of games, like Farmville and the one that Lauren just mentioned, Words with Friends. Which is basically a Scrabble ripoff, and they were sued because it's a Scrabble ripoff. But what's fundamentally different about that is that sort of with Wordle, like there's still that sort of self-motivation factor. Like there's the interaction with other people, but it's not direct. Whereas with games like Farmville and Words with Friends, you're literally playing against and with other people in this app that is then built into Facebook. And that is, I think, is an important distinction because the sort of the social interaction is more direct in that instance, whereas it's more indirect when it's a function of just like seeing things that are posted on social media and then feeling a particular way about it, because you could also just not do anything. Whereas when it comes to games that you're sort of like actively collaborating with other people online, like the game doesn't really progress unless both people are sort of like directly invested in what is going on. And that is really a fundamental difference. But the thing is, they're also like, we see sharing mechanics broadly speaking outside of social media as well, or sort of sometimes integrated with social media. Like there's a feature in PlayStation Share, PS Share, where like you can literally take screenshots and they will immediately post to social media, be it Twitter, which is where I usually see them, but I also have seen them on, of all places, Tumblr. I don't know how that works.
I think the issue, I use PS Share all the time, but I actually use it for recording videos, and then I unlist them on my own personal YouTube account for kind of like research purposes. And it's a direct integration. I think what's interesting is that the YouTube one is strange in that you're able to like edit your caption, edit your tags, and your description all from within the PlayStation interface.
Yeah.
But then your video is just the raw PlayStation video footage. It's not edited or anything.
Yeah.
So it definitely feels like a social way to like share your video.
Yeah.
But you don't share, well, you could share a video to Twitter. The Twitter length, right? Like an encapsulation would be it just takes way too long.
Yeah. Well, plus like Twitter videos are limited to 2 and like roughly 2 minutes, a little.
It's roughly 2 minutes. No, exactly. Yeah. Versus like in YouTube, you can be like, this is a 3-hour scene. No, and it'll just be uploading on your PlayStation while you're playing the game, which I think is kind of fascinating. It does make the game run slower.
Yeah.
Just as it should. But it also like but it doesn't actually hinder it too much. I never really thought about that before as a PS Share is like a social sharing, because I don't use it as a social feature. But then again, like I don't use a lot of social features as social features. So.
Well, I mean, what I'm trying to actually, because I kind of want to tease out some of the similarities, but then also some of the differences. So it's
right, yeah.
Because one of the things that I was thinking of in writing up the notes for this episode is like, okay, so the way in which you sort of like share your results on, like social media for Wordle, is that fundamentally similar to, or is that different from, say, like the way in which like achievements are visible on like Xbox Live or on PlayStation Network? Like, are those similar things or are those different things? What do you think?
I don't know. I was going to say I think they're different. One is about sharing an experience so you can talk about it. Yeah. Now, if we look at this 2 categories, right? Nicholas is asking, what are the difference and similarities between sharing a game experience you've had on PlayStation? We're going to use that as an example because I until recently, right, had finally got an Xbox game account in the year of our Lord, 2023, which is this year for anyone listening in the future or the past.
Okay. Right. Some weird
anyway, I'm
like, what the hell?
I'm in my PlayStation mindset, so as you can see, anything is possible. So we're going to take, what is the difference between sharing something that's an experience on PlayStation versus, I think, sharing Wordle? And I would say that for me, I have a difference. I'm sure you'll find a similarity, but for me, the difference is sharing a Wordle was kind of like a status. And it was not so much an achievement as it was a like, look at how I've succeeded, look at how I failed. In my case, it was look at how I cheated so that I didn't fail.
Look at how I looked it up online.
Look at how I looked it up online because it was like wrong. Yay! That's what my Wordles looked like. No, I'm kidding. I only had one like that because once I did that once, I was like, wow, I feel like a cheater because I was a cheater.
Yeah.
I felt like how I was and I didn't like it. But second is that this is like competitive. I felt like when I was sharing a Wordle, it was both to include myself in a discourse that I didn't belong as a person. This is personal feeling, right? So I'm a personal player. And I was like trying to see if I was better or worse or like my friends. And I think that there is this fundamentally like kind of social comparison aspect that I am just not, it's not that I'm not trained to see it. It's that, I don't want to compare myself to others. So World was about, let me compare this, right? It was a comparison kind of like mentality for sharing, right? And a competition. So comparison and competition versus like when I share, say, a Dragon Age video from PlayStation or I share God of War, that's more like, hey, look at my personal experience. And it might be the same as yours, especially like in this linear campaign, but look at how my character is different because I got to create my character. Yeah. Or look at how I chose to go through these scenarios. It's very personal. It's very individual, right? Yeah. There's no collective around it other than the community of Dragon Age being like absolutely loving and supportive on Twitter and on Tumblr. And we kill all the naysayers, pew pew. And like, but no, being loving, supporting, so I can share that. And then they're like, oh my gosh, that's so cool. I actually did this. Or wow, like I can't believe you got that facial combination. Or, like it's a lot more about like building each other up. Whereas I think Wordle is just like comparative enough that it like leads into the darkness of like,
the darker side is something that I kind of want to point to. So like, I mean, not to toot my own horn too much, but I'm really good at it. But I'm really good at it because I am a words person. Like, I spend 90% of my life. I literally
Wow,
trained
I
to be
am
a
not a
guy who
words
talks about
person.
words.
No,
and
I'm
so,
kidding. I'm kidding.
and
No, but
so
continue. Yeah.
and so as a result, like, and you can even see it sort of in the way in which I play, because I don't actually try to guess based upon like what I think it's going to be that particular day, but I use basic linguistic strategies, around like, vowel and consonant combinations. And so as a result, I can usually get it in 3 or 4 guesses. Um, but the thing is, like, there is a way in which, like, I have this one friend who shares their Wordle every single day on Facebook, and they're very smug about it, and it's really kind of annoying. And interestingly enough, what it made me think of, this is going to seem like a total non sequitur, but I think they are related, is the way in which, like, back in WoW during Wrath of the Lich King, which is the last expansion that I played in its entirety. I only played a little bit of Cataclysm and hated it, and that's when actually I canceled my account. But back in Wrath of the Lich King, I remember there was this point where, like, there were raids for like Ulduar and for Ice Crown, where, like, if you like, they would do pickup raids, but you wouldn't be able to get into the pickup raid unless you like linked the achievement for having already done the raid. And so there was this weird like elitism baked into what was essentially just like a pugged raid, which is sort of insane, that it's then going to be this like elitist thing, and that was specifically linked to the accumulation of achievements. And that's what sort of the comparison that I wanted to draw it back to, is then the achievement is not then, because there are people who like, trophy hunters, people who like want to get all the achievements in the game, but that is very personally motivated. Whereas in this instance, the achievement is something that you then sort of flash to other people to sort of convince them of something about yourself, in the same way that sort of like, I have run into like, I don't share my Wordles at all. I just do it for myself. And but people who do share, generally speaking, I don't have a problem with. But I have run into these occasional individuals who kind of use it as this like weird elitist sense of superiority, which is strange
Let's
because it's a
yeah.
browser game.
No, I know, like, that. Yeah, browser games aside, like, I think elitism does not need a browser or a true simulated experience. Like, I think elitists don't need anything. They're just themselves, and they will just act that way.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of curious, like, can we kind of talk about and tease out what you're just really briefly before I want to move in more into like the mechanics of Wordle and how it is as a game,
Yeah.
right? I'm actually curious to that Wrath of the Lich King comparison that you're making.
Yeah.
And I had to stifle myself. None of you saw it, but I was like, you're one of those people. Like, you just got off at Cataclysm. I was one of the people that came back because of Cataclysm. So, like, that's really interesting.
Whatever.
I really was. So I did Watlick, and then
Yeah.
I actually got off before the raid thing because I could kind of see the darkness. And so I was like, I don't want any part of that.
Yeah.
And then I actually never raided in Watlick. I just kind of played it. And then I took off. So I stopped paying for my subs. But I was also like, I didn't have all the money in the world to be paying for this. So I was like,
Yeah.
right. So I kind of took a break. When Cataclysm happened and I saw the world get destroyed, I was like, I want that. And so I immediately rebought like the expansion and the flying, right? Because that's when they introduced flying mounts. I ate the crap out of that. I was like, Cataclysm was my X pack. I got back in, and then once again, money. I wanted to play Legion, and then fell off. No, it was. You know what? I don't know the order anymore. I'm not gonna lie to you. I think it was.
Okay, I can go through it if you want. So you have Classic, you have Burning Crusade, you have Wrath of the Lich King, you have Cataclysm, you have Mists of Cataclysm, Mists of Pandaria, Legion.
It was Pandaria, Legion, and then Draenor.
Oh no, sorry, Draenor Legion. It's Draenor
Legion. Yeah,
sorry,
that's what I'm trying to say. No, it's fine.
Yeah. Draenor Legion, and then
But I must have. I fell off
Battle
at
for
Pandaria.
Azeroth, Shadowlands, and now Dragonflight.
No, yep. Okay, great.
Jesus
so
Christ,
for all of you know, there's so many.
Like
for all of you who needed to know that.
that.
I love how you came to Final Fantasy 14 after all of this like WoW categories. Anyway, I wanted to tease that out for the reason that I never thought about how a Wordle achievement could be kind of comparison all the way back into you need these achievements in order to participate in that pickup raid.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of curious, like, what for you actually drew that comparison between the two? Like, was it Was it just a similarity of elitism like in Wordle, or was it more of the competitive or the
Well, it's because
comparison?
it's the way in which sort of like the game both then works within sort of like a predetermined social situation. So in the case of the raid scenario, there is like a culture of like the people on my server where and this was true on other servers as well, but where like there was this point like it was often difficult to get into raiding precisely because no one would like take you and like hold your hand through it or at least like help you learn things. they
Right.
they literally expected you to already know how to
Mhm.
do something, which is sort of silly because there's always going to be players who have never done it before.
Yeah.
And so then like the achievement then functions within sort of this pre-established culture and social order on the server, because like the sort of the way in which the achievement is being used is not determinative of the elitism is determinative of how the achievement is being used. And so then you see a similar thing with people who are like using their Wordle results in this particular way, where like they Wordle did not turn them into elitist assholes. They are elitist assholes and sort of are using this as sort of like an emblem or a badge of that elitism in the same way that within the culture of my particular server, they're using this specific because the thing is like there's other ways you could determine whether or not someone is a good healer or a good DPS or a good tank. There are many ways you could determine this, but they used that one because it's a status symbol. And so then that to me is sort of the fundamental similarity, is sort of using this game accomplishment as a status symbol. And that's kind of unique and I think a little strange, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, that is actually really unique and strange. But like now that I can see your comparison, I mean, because we were kind of talking about the similarities of like how we feel Wordle came about, I think this is a great stepping point into this next phase of the episode where we're going to go in and talk about actual Wordle, right? The mechanics and the similarities of that.
Well,
And
in
I'm
many ways, we're
super
going to talk about like the sort of the situation of Wordle. Like,
it
yeah, the
is.
mechanics, but the situation of
It's the
it. Yeah.
situation of Wordle, but I think it's understanding how Wordle exists, like you kind of dissected that server's social, right, norms and statuses around that, I think
Yeah.
is a very strong comparison for Wordle. So I'm very excited to kind of tip into that frame of reference
Yeah.
because we need to start with how Wordle functions as a game, right?
Yeah.
Just kind of like how raiding as a feature of right this larger game,
Yeah.
right? That could honestly raids could be a browser game, right? You could pick up a raid with your friends
Yeah.
on a browser and go do it, right? Because it's a feature.
Well,
So I
theoretically, you need a lot of memory to do that because browsers are very memory.
no,
Crazy.
okay, hardware aside, mentally you could do it. So I
Yeah.
think that's going
Yes.
to be really interesting.
Okay, so one of the things that kind of fascinated me about Wordle, especially at the end, I had this thought at the end of 2022, which is when we actually decided to cover this, which is that it is, and I would say, bar none, like one of the largest like games of 2022. And yet, when it came to like all the year end lists and like the game awards and all that stuff that happens in December that sort of determines like, you know, what the character of of the video games were in that particular year, Wordle was really kind of absent. And so I was thinking about this like why is it that this huge game, absolutely huge game is just kind of not really allowed to be uh like an actual like game.
No, I totally get it. It's really hard for me to like look at I don't know, to look at Wordle and to look at how you want to describe it. And then you're like, it's not a game. Like I get it. I was like, I struggle to find the words because there's no such thing as a real game.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
There's no such thing as a fake game. All games are games, right?
Yeah.
But it's something that it's one of the biggest games of 2022, and yet somehow it's not actually considered in the same class, right?
Yeah.
Of video games. And is it
Yeah.
because it is in a browser, right? Like, or like I'm saying, or I'm
I
starting to get ahead of myself,
yeah,
but I
yeah, yeah,
think that
yeah.
it's now, is it because of, and it's dot, 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 and you can just list a ton of reasons, right? Where you're trying to make an excuse for this type of behavior or perception.
Well, I think it's really the social situation of the game. And I think there are a couple of specific things that we can look at as kind of like indicators of what that social situation is. One is its sort of broad popularity. There is this sort of perverse thing and you see this all the time in like discourse about video games, where like if a game is really popular amongst people who are not considered to be gamers, and I have giant scare quotes around this word. We're setting that aside for the moment. Like somehow they don't get to be games for like there's a lot of, especially with like mobile games, you see a lot of condescension that is directed towards them because somehow they don't exist. They're not properly situated.
Yeah.
So if you think about Wordle, like who publishes Wordle? The New York Times.
Well, now it's the New York Times.
Yeah, now, well, yeah, but it was a very quick turnaround from when it was first released to when it was, and most people know it through through New York Times. They don't know it from its like original indie release.
Well, what's interesting, okay, so here we go though. Here's what's interesting. We're already seeing a sociological class divide in the games
Yes,
industry
yeah,
here. Is that for me, the New York Times bought it months after. Now, it may have been weeks, but like it felt, because game dev time is wibbly wobbly and also very stretched out.
Yeah.
Okay, is that like 1 month feels like 7 years sometimes.
Well, this was
So
also
I
during the
remember,
pandemic, so there
and
was
it's
the
also
time
during the pandemic, so there is
yeah.
no such thing as time. I truly felt like the New York Times bought Wordle months after it. My friends had been playing it. The discourse had been starting it
Yeah.
like every single day. Oh my gosh, this has been going on forever. It was almost as pervasive as Pokemon Go, but minus the whole you have to run around for that one Snorlax and 20 people are all in this one gas station trying to find a Snorlax in like the bowels of summer in Florida.
Yeah.
Just for very specific, crazy, hot, sweltering weather. So you can feel that, okay? Feel that with me. Feel that memory with me.
Yeah.
Now, in this memory of Wordle, it's me using a hybrid workflow, going into into office during the Delta pandemic, trying not to go into office during the whole Delta outbreak. Also, Wordle is becoming a thing. Everyone's very competitive in my workplace. Everyone's playing ping pong, and they're like, "I beat you in ping pong, but like you can't beat me in Wordle." Like it was like
Wow.
cutthroat. Okay,
It's the
and then
nerdiest thing I've ever
suddenly
heard anyone say.
it was very nerdy. This is my work environment. And I can't do ping pong or Wordle. And I'm like, could I just maybe like, I don't know, sing in Rock Band? Because apparently Rock Band singing is great.
No,
10 out of 10.
Lauren, secret normie.
Secret normie. I'm a secret normie in the game world of games. No, but like that's what I'm saying is there's already this class. The reason why I don't want to call it a class structure, and I'm gonna say this because who likes classism? Nobody likes. I mean, unless you are a classist, nobody likes classism.
Yeah.
And the reason why I'm saying there's already some social stratums here is for me, I remember playing Wordle like I'm not saying day one launch, but maybe day two, where it was like, oh, did you guys hear this like indie game just came out? It's called Wordle. What? This indie game? Like this is how right game development, this like class of people on the edge are.
Yeah.
Suddenly we're playing it. And then I think a week later someone was like, my mom found Wordle. Like it was like that kind of turnaround. Like
but that moment, like when it sort of exploded, is really synonymous when it was picked up by the Times.
Yes.
And yes, you started to see like my mom playing it, or like like my old classics friends from grad school who like I don't think have picked up a console video game since they were like 5. All of a sudden are talking about it constantly, and I think it's in that moment that's when it really became a social phenomenon, not just like a game phenomenon.
Yeah. And I wanted to break that in the context of like, because I am not trying to put myself like in this like, oh, but I'm in the indie upper echelon first adopter Apple products or whatever class. Like that is not correct. But I think what you find in games, what you're alluding to, Nicholas, is there's like these social stratas or social norms where we're now looking at each other, right? And going, this is a class of video games, right? It's this AAA, so high quality.
Yep.
Okay, these are just like the peg below, right? And we've kind of talked about this in terms of, right, the AAA structure, AA, what makes a game indie or independent, when a lot of, say, AAA quality games have actually only been made by one person, right? Or what is a indie game like Hades now actually becoming a AAA title with a massive fan base and now a sequel, the first time they've ever done a sequel, right? Which now is going into a franchise structure, which is then very reticent of a AAA,
very AAA,
right? I mean, it's a very AAA bold move. And like, and in all like of those arguments aside, the Wordle phenomenon for me is actually something much deeper and more particularly interesting because it's not a game that we can, in our prejudice, go, well, it's a video game, so X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
No, this is Wordle. This is everybody played, biggest game. And yet in our society, right, there is this divide,
Yeah,
right? And
there's a
now
clear disconnect. Yeah,
it's a very clear disconnect.
and I
So
think
so
so.
please go into it, because I was like, this is just me kind of setting up, right?
Yeah,
Like what I'm mulling over, or what I've been mulling over, right?
I think the important element to add to all of that is that the way in which things, especially like cultural artifacts, get defined has less to do with their actual like particulars, like whatever features or content they may have, and has far more to do with sort of like their social construction, the way in which like the people who sort of think of themselves as having particular identities or particular like experiences or subjective relationships to reality, however you want to define it, like they then sort of cohere an identity not just around themselves, but also sort of the artifacts or the objects that they accumulate around them. And so if anyone is interested, there's a really great book about this sort of concept. It's called Art Worlds. It's by Howard Becker, and he talks about this way in which like the work of art, like the art object, this thing that is sort of elusive and has always been impossible to define. And the reason why he claims it's impossible to define is precisely because people always take a formal approach to it. They're trying to look at the art object and determine its artness based upon the thing. Whereas what he's trying to argue is that its artness derives from the social institutions like galleries and museums and schools, and the people who then act as like gatekeepers or arbiters of taste. And so then the analogy of that to the the video game industry is the designers, but it's also the journalists, it's the critics, et cetera, et cetera.
I did not say this in the comments of my notes when we were talking about this, because I wanted to say it to your face. But
Oh God.
I know I love Howard Becker's Art Worlds. It is a phenomena into itself for
Yeah.
me. Growing up in it was a very art forward household. It's a very poetry forward household,
Yeah.
right? And for me, my family being, right, it's kind of disconnected society, mix mash of like cultures and all these different things,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
moving us from super Texas to super New England, right, to super deep south, to
Yeah.
now
Super
I'm
Missouri.
super Missouri, very super,
Yeah.
very miserable. But like going through all of these connections, and then I find myself at one of the prestigious literary schools for writing,
Oh
right,
God.
at the University of Iowa.
Oh God.
And I'm saying it like that because it was very clear to me that they're like, look, our society of writers is literary. We're
Yeah.
creating a craft of art
Yeah.
with what makes true writing. And no one's going to be reading science fiction anymore. And I
Yeah.
have to say it like that because I was a genre writer.
Yeah.
And that's what it's called in literary terms, by the way, boys and girls, is that genre fiction is, which is funny because everything's a genre,
Yeah.
is anything that is just not pure fiction.
Yeah, well, because
Like,
it's okay. So, like genre fiction then is sort of like in this marked territory. It's like the mobile game or the browser game or the indie game.
exactly.
But then if you like, but then it's like, okay, well, what is a game? What is just like a work of fiction? The unmarked version of those things, and that's actually for those of you who want to go to grad school, if you say like the unmarked term, your professor will jizz themselves.
No, yeah, and then you will get an A. So, as a Slytherin's in the room here with the Ravenclaw, I'm just saying this
Yeah.
is how to get an A.
But that unmarked term like fiction or game, like the thing is like those actually have discrete features. It's just they're invisibilized, like we sort of put them into the background. Whereas with genre fiction, with like horror, with sci-fi, with fantasy, like then all of their features are foregrounded. And so, but the thing
Yes.
is, like, but then it leads to this perverse set of circumstances where people can then compartmentalize and be like, well, that's not really a game. That's a mobile game. That's not really a game. That's a browser game. That's a tabletop game. It's like, no, those are all games. But then the question we have to ask is like, okay, not only one, what is that unmarked game referring to, but also who is situated themselves in a position where they get to determine what that is.
Yes, and it is the deterministic perception, right, of these games that make them unmarked,
Yeah.
right? And the reason why we're calling this out is because we look at Wordle and you feel like you know what it is. But for the purposes of this podcast, I hope you recognize that it is because of the perception, because of the society in which we look at a game and what are the elements of a game that we're putting to the background so that other types of games, like, oh, well, mobile, the platform that it's on, the fact that you can move it around,
Yep.
not talking about how Pokemon started as a mobile game because it was on the Game Boy Advanced. Like, does
Yeah.
that mean Pokemon was a mobile game
Well,
first?
yeah, and that's weird. Like, so like handheld devices, why aren't handheld platforms considered mobile games? Because they're
And is
not.
it exactly? They're not. And is it because they aren't on a smartphone, which is weird because smartphones came after a console, like, a handheld
Yeah.
console.
Yeah.
So it's all of this perception, right? Is who is determining what can and cannot be invisible, which can say, hey, this is the acceptable norm, right, of a game.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's really interesting here, is because despite the fact that Wordle is probably the top or most played game of 2022, the game awards, right, aren't going, Wordle is this incredibly defining, right, like piece of mobile. It's not even considered a mobile game because it's on a
Nope.
browser,
Yeah.
right? So now it's even further removed. But not just like, right, Nicholas was saying, is not every game is, well, this is a Sony game or this is an Xbox game. Much as this could be another topic, but much as Microsoft and PlayStation want you to have these, this is a Sony experience and this is what a Microsoft experience will be, much as these corporations would like this to be, we're not going to define things by platform, right? This is a horror game, right? This is a
Yeah.
survival game,
Yeah.
right? And I think this is a shooter, and that's just like right? But to
Yeah.
say, when you look at it like that, that doesn't mean that a Wordle player doesn't like horror, or that someone who plays Wordle or Words with Friends isn't also going to play like Bloodborne. Like, there's all of these different nuances that our society creates. So I think that it's really fascinating to kind of see all this come together.
So yeah,
Right?
I think there's a related issue here too. So like we're starting to get into the question of like who are sort of like the tastemakers or like who gets to sort of like determine, but also we need to talk a little bit about like who gets excluded from these categories and why. Like, I mean, gamer is a similar situation. Like, gamer is kind of everyone. Everyone plays games in some capacity or another. But that term gamer is very narrowly circumscribed.
Yeah.
And I used to think that this was just a feature of like bitchy people online. But okay, so full disclosure for those of you who don't know, I'm currently working on a UX certification. So I've been doing a lot of, background reading on, UX research and so forth. And there's this one blog that I came across on the UX Collective, and I'll link it if people are interested, in which the designer in question was talking about how they primarily work on VR experiences for, as they said, arcade rooms. But I was like, okay, you can just say arcades. People know what an arcade is. But what I found really
No, an
interesting,
arcade room, a room
yeah,
dedicated to the arcade.
well, and I think I understood what he was trying to say, which is that there are a lot of places where there are sort of like dedicated like VR like spaces that aren't
Mhm.
necessarily within like a specific like fully functioning like branded arcade
Mhm.
context like a Dave and Buster's or something like that. So, but this article begins by talking about how like his specialty is designing for, and he literally says non-players, and I was like, what is that? And then as I started to go through the article, in many ways the non-player was sort of synonymous with the sort of like the non-gamer, and the
I
not
love that you are just now bringing this article up to me right now, because I'm like, we obviously we have time in between this, but I'm just
yeah.
like, I'm sorry, what? Now I'm going to your article,
Yeah,
but
no,
what?
it's kind of crazy. I'm not going to talk much about the substance of the article because this is the thing that I found fascinating, is that like even people who work within the industry, the person whose like entire remit is how do I think about games as they relate to people, the people playing them, is saying that there is this thing known as a sort of like a non-entity or like a non-gamer, and then there are all sorts of presumptions that come with that, and if you're interested in reading it, you can see this, like the idea that sort of like controls and mechanics need to be simpler because non-players can't possibly comprehend complex mechanics, which, by the way, that's not actually how people understand mechanics. It's not how tutorials work. There's a lot of weird assumptions there, but the thing is, these assumptions really do exist, and it's not just that there is a kind of discourse about them. It's that the games themselves are being built in such a way that reflect these assumptions. And I find that crazy and fascinating.
That is, well, one, it is crazy and fascinating, but two, that is actually like kind of in the question that I really wanted to dig into, is that who is perpetuating these states of affairs, is that we have to recognize that we are, this is going to almost sound, I was going to say paternal, or like, you know what I mean? Like a parent would say it, not like maternal, paternal, like, you know, it's going to sound like there's a different word for it that I think is probably gender neutral, but probably not. Yay, English. But we were raised, okay, all of us, we were raised in an environment, regardless of your age, in which the society around us thinks that there is a specific type of video game.
Yeah.
I'm going to say video game here because it can't just be game. It has to be video game. It has to be a visual and auditory experience that is akin to playing a video, which for everyone is like a YouTube, okay?
Yeah.
No, I'm kidding. You all know what a video is. Right?
Which is on the cathode ray tube.
What is the cathode ray tube? Right? But this oh man, I love that. Sorry. But I think that this is incredibly important to recognize that around us, we are raised, right? And we as humans want to belong to that society, right? And so when I brought up kind of the stratiation to kind of harken back to what AAA is, AA is, end of indie, etc., is that it's really kind of about like, if we are part of the problem because we were raised where we believe that AAA is the highest quality of gaming for these invisible reasons of video gaming, video graphical fidelity. You know, how much, not just how much money it is, but hey, it appeals to a large subset of audiences. It has a mass market appeal.
How many triangles does your game have?
How many triangles does your game have? How much, honestly, this is going to be funny. How much math does your game have? A game with more math is more AAA. Yeah. And that probably sounds very strange coming out of my mouth. But then also, right, there's a hierarchy of developer now. Whenever you go to a networking event, and I say now, but there's kind of always kind of been this way, is that there's always been a hierarchy in society, right? If you went to like the president's ball, obviously the president is going to be the first figure, like he's going to be the big guy, right?
Yeah.
This is the United States president, by the way. No, you might hate him, you might not agree with him, and somehow you got an invitation and you're there, but you already can go, I am entering this ball as, you know, Corvo from Dishonored, and there's the president, and do you know what I mean? Like you've got this inherency, I'm not meant to be here, and you've got this is his event. Right.
Yeah.
And then all down that line, right, is now you've got your bodyguards, his wife, right, the children, but now you've got everyone who's equal with him, the senators. You've got already, your brain has created a social class that is going to somehow have to get you worked up, right? And you understand the social ladder. And you translate this into games with, oh, I'm a AAA developer. Suddenly, for some reason, because you've been employed by a company, right, everyone's like, oh my God, what is it like to work in AAA? And I have to agree, though, right, is that I'm a part of a problem in that it's not so much a problem as that there are huge differences for me working on a team of 300 people and 150, right, to when I was in indie development working with 7 or working with even 50, okay?
Yeah.
Because the amount of engineers and QA to the ratio of designers, like I've been on teams of designers as 1. I've been on teams of designers as 3. I've been on teams of designers of 70. So I think it's just like, and then everywhere in between. And it is different, right? And it does take more money to create a AAA. But to perpetuate that for some reason, a video game experience at this level, you see what I'm getting at, is inherently somehow higher or worth aspiring to. And I'm not saying if that is your aspiration, that's great. But it's not a ladder. It's not you climb from the drudges of, indie to now you get to work at some place like Supermassive, right? Or Supergiant. And then you keep climbing and suddenly, you get to Ubisoft, and Ubisoft is the prime jewel, which would just be terrible. Don't. And there's nothing, I have lots of friends at Ubi, by the way. So, or Ubisoft. So
yeah, Ubi, remember it's Fingersoft.
Yes. Okay. So I do love that. Not Squaresoft, Fingersoft.
Fingersoft.
Oh man, that just occurred to me that soft was like the name because of software. Okay,
yeah,
let's move on.
Like from software, Squaresoft. Okay,
damn it!
Wow.
You look. Wow.
Lauren.
Sometimes look at me. Sometimes I'm dumb, and I think I want to draw this parallel because this is truly right. The perpetuation is that whoever wrote your article, right, probably like felt like they had to work their way up, but was also taught from someone who had that mentality, right? That said, hey, the players play AAA.
Yeah.
Non-players don't play AAA. They play Words with Friends.
Yeah.
And you create this immediate class of users who are somehow your mom or your grandma, and apparently not being able to tutorialize for that is somehow lesser than we don't need to tutorialize it because they could
Yeah.
just look it up on Wiki.
Yeah.
Right. And that's kind of that was the original Destiny 2 model
Yeah.
ish, in that like they weren't trying to appeal to players who hadn't played Destiny 2 before, or Destiny, the franchise, before when they started. That is what I'm going to say. They have gone through a huge, right, gambit, etc. I'm not calling out any of the developers, right? This is just more I've done it. I've done it. When I was working on my projects, I've gone, man, do we really need to tutorialize this? Because I would really just like for them to look it up. And at the time, because I was raised in an environment where they're like, yes, you need to tutorialize how to punch someone. You're going to do it, right? They were like, we cannot assume that our player knows how to punch. And that was a really eye-opener for me. One, obviously that's who I was raised by, but this UX guy was not. And I like saying raised because it is like, I like to think of myself as a sprout. So they are also watering me, right, with knowledge.
So in the interest of not necessarily calling out this individual, I think where they're coming from is actually a perfectly understandable impulse, because the thing is, what they're trying to do with their design practice is actually make gaming experiences as broadly available as possible. And I think really there are two problems. One, there is a lack of vocabulary for like how to conceptualize a group of people who are traditionally excluded and or not really like thought of when it comes to sort of like designing particular experiences for particular players. But then in addition to that, there is the fact that like, you know, your average game designer, no matter what role they work in, whether they're an engineer, they're an artist, level designer, a narrative systems designer, creative lead, a marketer, whatever, like they tend to be people who play a lot of games. They tend to be people who play a lot of different kinds of games. So like their experience of like what you should and should not know when you come to a game initially is going to be wildly different from the person who like the last video game they may have played was like a Frogger cabinet in an arcade back in 1989. But the thing is, that's the majority of people. And so the thing is, when you, to sort of bring this back to Wordle, when you look at a game like Wordle, like its mechanics are extremely legible to that particular kind of individual. And so like that is really in many ways the brilliance of its design, is it stems from the ability to step outside of a lot of those presumptions that designers often have when they like as Lauren was just saying, like, you know, do we really need to turn this into a tutorial? And the answer sometimes is yes.
Yes.
Like you really do.
No, and I think Nicholas is giving us a great wrap up here, because I think the biggest thing that we're going to help answer right in the Patreon episode is digging more into the state of affairs and how we currently got there.
Yep.
But I want to kind of point out that I wasn't trying to super harp on the individual. It was just more like I am a part of the problem sometimes.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
Right? Yep. Is that even myself, right? Hey, we're making this title. I work in AAA. They've already been doing these things.
Yeah.
And I need to recognize, right? I'm a big invisible tutorial person, right? If you've ever watched the Game Maker's Toolkit, that's how they call it. I call it organic tutorialization, right? Or innate tutorialization, where you're playing something that maybe even had a tutorial about it, like it had a blurb or something. Yep. But you used it so integrated in the mechanics, you didn't realize that you were using it exactly the way you should be using it, because that's how integrated it was with the game. And I also kind of wanted to call out what you're saying, Nicholas, is that sometimes people were gamers in the 80s and 90s playing things like in the arcade, because I took my parents to an arcade or to the National Video Game Museum in Frisco, Texas. Yeah. We drove like 2.5 hours or something to get there, by the way, because Texas is way too big.
This is too big, yeah.
and we weren't central to it. And my dad and my mom were like playing the shit out of all those arcade games. They're like, man, I haven't done this in years. Because like, yeah, they haven't, but they were like playing the games like they had literally never left the arcade. Yep. I was very impressed because, I mean, they're my parents. Also because we never went to the arcade as a kid. Like they watched me play, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And I don't know if it's because they felt too old or also if games left them behind. right?
Yeah.
And I think that was just really eye-opening for me to be like, look, Wordle appeals to this because it is a simplified, right, structure of the mechanics. But it doesn't mean that games can't be that, right, in the
Yeah.
future. And I am glad that this guy is doing that article for it. But it's just I am sometimes, right?
Yeah.
When you get in your strata, I am the problem.
So it's unfortunate that we're going to have to cut off the conversation there. But if you do want to hear more about those people who have gotten left behind, why the video games industry seems to have left them behind, we will be discussing that in depth on our Patreon episode, which will be coming out next week. And if you want to listen to that, you go over to patreon.com/Furidashi and sign up at the $5 tier. You can also sign up at an advanced level for things like transcripts of previous episodes, as well as proofs of our book chapters. But until then, we want to thank you all for listening and hope you stay safe.